Hey everybody, it's Peter again. I have with us the infamous Larry Bond and the more than infamous Chris Carlson, the ultra infamous, ultra megafist,
Mega
megafist. Um, it's been a little bit. What about almost probably 2 months, almost or a month at least since we talked.
It's been a little over a month.
Yeah. So first of all, how are y'all doing? Did you go to any events since we last talked?
Oh, Historicon.
How did that go? It looked like y'all had full house.
Uh, and then some.
Awesome. Did you you put on any scenarios or was it mostly talks?
Three games and one presentation. Basically, the one I'm giving today.
Awesome. What scenarios had you run games for, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, we ran one for we ran the Falklands campaign scenario that we ran last year, Operation Sutton, which was called Sutton Death. We had a Dawn of the Battleship scenario titled Boer Belligerency, which was kind of a cluster, and then uh, well, I wasn't there for the end of the World War, the Command at Sea game, and I don't even remember the name. It was a convoy, hypothetical convoy, where all the German bad boys show up and are met by British battleships.
That was what, Operation Vlorschhammer?
Easy for you to say.
Well, yeah. But basically, the gist of that was Scharnhorst and Gneisenau got out and linked up with Bismarck and Prinz Eugen. And then you had the British forces all scattered around. So nobody had a really good idea of where they were. We attempted to do some of the initial movement with Simplot to keep double blind.
Okay.
In general, it works, but it's too slow for a convention setting. So, which was what I was afraid of. But until you try it, you don't know.
What do you think would work better? Just kind of separating people and just using trace paper or something to that degree? Just kind of go back old school, or what do you think would improve that?
The next game I'm going to try, we're definitely going to go old school and just use hex maps.
Okay. Okay.
And let them push counters. That way, it's really easy to adjudicate without letting them see the other guy.
Right, and I'm assuming you would use hexes that are pretty much visibility maximum anyway, right? I mean,
pretty much, yeah. You'd assume about a maximum of maybe 40, 50 miles across.
Yeah. It depends how much room you have operationally, of course, right? So.
Oh yeah.
How are things going on the product front?
Well, we were going to talk about products at the end after Chris's presentation.
Okay,
we can do that now if you'd like, but I think people would rather hear what Chris has to say first.
Oh yeah, sure, that's fine. Chris, if you're ready to roll.
All right, let me get this up and get ready to share my screen.
Okay.
Let me get my... It is present here. That's right.
I just reset the format, so it should be good. There you go.
Let me go to full screen. Because that gives us the best look. There we go. Okay, I want to hide this. Didn't want that. Let's try that again. Oh, Lord of mercy.
I think if you just...
There we go. Okay, so this is an expanded version of the briefing that I gave at the China Maritime Studies Institute's Chinese Undersea Warfare Conference. In particular, I was to talk about nuclear submarine design. H.I. Sutton talked about diesel submarines, conventional submarines, and there were other panelists that covered sensors and weapons. So I largely just focused on the design of the submarines themselves. And when you get right down to it, China has long held a view of achieving nuclear submarines at sea. The SSBN, the ballistic missile submarine, was their ultimate goal. And so they tried really hard to get the Soviet Union to help them. And repeatedly, Mao was rebuffed on that. So he, in 1959, went down this imposed self-reliance, and they were going to produce nuclear power, both the reactor, the propulsion system, as well as everything else to support a long-distance voyage, basically from scratch. And China basically got started in October 1958. That's when the design team was formed. And because all the information on US, British, and Russian submarine reactors were all highly classified, all they could do was pour over open source. And so they grabbed articles, textbooks, they even grabbed models to try and get some insights. The first 091 was eventually completed and commissioned into service in August 1974. And it was hailed as a big triumph. And when you look at the big picture, it was. They produced a submarine. The problem is, mechanically, the boat was a disaster. It had a lot of problems. Well, over the next 49 years, China's been improving its submarine capabilities, its production, its technology base. And they're now, if they haven't started building the 095, they're real close to starting. And this will be a world-class boat. It will not be second tier at all. So the self-reliance, 1958, Russia and China had a lot of agreements to exchange information, exchange technology, predominantly from the Soviet Union. But China really wanted to build a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. So in July 1958, Mao approved, after the military commission had sent it forward, approved the Project 09 submarine issue. They formed their research group in 1958, and they got started. Now, Mao knew they would need some help, and they really sought technical assistance from the Soviet Union. But Khrushchev was very reluctant to give it. He was, there was some indications that he was concerned about even sharing ballistic missiles and even a prototype nuclear weapon, which he had agreed to because of concern of how the US would react. On top of that, Khrushchev and Mao's relationship wasn't exactly the best. It was somewhat strained. Neither one liked each other, nor did they trust each other. Mao feared Russia, who had historically tried to dominate China, and Khrushchev was expecting some payback for all the stuff that the Soviet Union was providing. And then, unfortunately, in October 1959, Khrushchev, in talking to the Chinese premier, was a little bit impolite and basically claimed that China didn't have the technology base, it didn't have the intellectual capital to build a nuclear submarine. And Mao didn't take that well, and basically said, we will build nuclear submarines if it takes us 10,000 years, and off they ran. Unfortunately, progress was slow. That's because there was a very small cadre of people that had any experience in nuclear power or nuclear weapons, and they were in competition. The nuclear weapons development group had more, shall we say, oomph. And they were the ones that got more of the people and more of the funding. On top of that, you had Mao's Great Leap Forward, which was causing a fair amount of political and economic chaos. Well, between the two of those, it became pretty clear that they couldn't develop nuclear weapons, atomic bombs, and develop the submarine simultaneously. So in March 1963, the submarine program was postponed, and the priority was given to nuclear weapons development. China did retain a cadre of engineers to keep looking at technical options, particularly on the nuclear reactor side, but also other technologies and other building concepts. And they also continued to gather open source data. Now, the four gentlemen you see down there are really kind of the ranking members of China's fledgling submarine community. Peng Xilu, he's basically the Rickover. He concentrated on nuclear reactors with his assistant Zhao Renkai next to him. Huang Weilu, he developed the missile for the Type 092. And then Huang Zhuwei, he was the big overall submarine designer. These four guys are the ones who really pushed everything.
If you can hold for just 1 second, Chris, I don't know if your presentation is showing properly. Larry, are you seeing his presentation move? You're muted, Larry.
No, I'm not seeing anything. I've still got the header page up on my screen.
Yeah, we only see the header, so I apologize for interrupting you. But
all right, hang on a second. Let me go back and reshare this.
There you go. Something just updated, but
wow, that took an awful long time.
Okay, now we see the individuals that you were just talking about. I'd say keep it in this format and maybe just hit that little gray arrow thing right next to that just to get rid of your. There you go.
Yeah, I'll just increase the size a bit, if you will, and then just do it this way.
That's fine. Now we're seeing it update. Okay, sorry. I apologize for interrupting. Go.
No. You had to because things weren't happening,
and go.
Right, these are the four gents I was speaking about. Peng Xilu, the big guy with the reactors, his assistant Zhao to his right, and then the guy on the far left, Huang Zhewu, he's the big guy who basically covered the rest of the submarine design. So between Peng and Huang, those are the big people in that started nuclear submarine development and nuclear submarine construction. Now, the big question for them is, what kind of reactor are we going to use? Because there are a few types. Like I said earlier, the amount of information available was limited to that associated with civilian marine nuclear reactor plants. In particular, you had the Otto Hahn, which was a basic merchant ship out of West Germany. Same thing for the U.S. with the Savannah. The Lenin was an icebreaker, and the Japanese was following behind all three of them with the Mutsu. Now, the discussion, and you see a lot of this in the book by Lewis and Jouet, which is on the development of strategic nuclear submarines, was whether or not to go with the Otto Hahn reactor or the Lenin reactor. That's what you see a lot in some of the histories. The problem with the Otto Hahn reactor is that it's an integrated reactor design. What that means is that the steam generation capability is inside the reactor vessel. Now, this is theoretically superior, but it's a heck of a lot harder to build. And the Chinese were a little worried about taking something like that on. So the decision was made to go with what's called a loop reactor. And what that means is that the steam generators are separate entities connected by loops of pipes. And in particular, they looked at the Savannah, Lenin, and Mutsu plants. Now, in most open sources, you'll see references that said that the Chinese chose a Soviet OK-150 reactor plant. Well, there's a little problem with that. It's big. The OK-150, when you look at its general size, is about 10 meters wide and 10 meters tall, and then it's harder to give you a number on its length because there are three of them in the Lenin. But the length or the width and the height basically preclude you could ever put this into a 091 pressure hull, which is 9 meters. So what I think the histories are telling us is that a loop reactor was chosen, but it wasn't the OK-150 that was executed and put into the 091. And that's why you see a lot of references to 90 megawatts thermal, because that's the power rating of the OK-150. When you actually look at what the Chinese have showed us in terms of video and in the museum display at Qingdao, it looks a whole lot more like the Mutsu plant. I mean, in comparison to all the others, it's much more consistent with Mutsu. That reactor had a power rating of 36 megawatts, and it had 12 control rods in comparison to 24 or 25 with the OK-150. Now, when we look at the history of the 091, we do get some good snippets on how big the reactor vessel was. And it's not quite as big as the OK-150, and it has 19 control rods. And we see that at a number of different places. In the upper right, you see a photo looking down on the reactor vessel. Below that, you have a picture that shows rod positioning on the reactor plant control panel. And then on the left, you see a diagram that's being used for training. So we have a good idea. We have really good data that says it has 19 control rods. And in Lewis and Jouet's book, they have an interesting reference to an unidentified Chinese engineer who stated that the power level was 48 megawatts. And when you look at how fast the 091 went and about how much power the turbine generators drove, 48 megawatts works out really pretty well, assuming a thermal efficiency in the low 20 percentile range. If you were to make that 90 megawatts and keep everything else constant, this would be a horribly inefficient plant. And the Chinese knew better. So I'm going with 48 megawatts initially. When they started working on the 092, they found they could boost it by 20%, that the plant could handle that extra power. And they went to 58 megawatts thermal in the 092 and the last three 091s. And this is just some screenshots from a CCTV 7 discussion about the museum. You see a mock-up of the plant. You see a model of the steam generator, and it looks an awful lot like the one that was on a historical video that was seen being moved over by the shipyard. So this looks really good. Now, when you look at the Bohai shipyard, the original construction hall, only two building ways were dedicated to submarine production. And those are the ones inside the red box. The submarines would come out, they would be rolled over to the launch barge, that would be floated across, and then you would sink the barge and the submarine would float, hopefully. Between 1996 and 87, this facility produced five Type 091s and one 092. There's a real big gap. And part of that is because when Deng Xiaoping came into power, he initiated 4 modernizations in 1978. And one of those was the military modernization. Deng was not a fan of the nuclear submarine. They basically didn't feel they were getting their money's worth. And in fact, there's a declassified CIA report from 1984 that cites Chinese sources as saying that the military capability was so limited, it wasn't worth their very high cost, and construction would be halted after the last submarine of the 091 series was completed. So from 1988 to 98, because the last 091 came out in 1988, they didn't build. And they actually were kind of in a holding pattern. There was still a low-level effort going on in design work because they were specifically looking at a more powerful loop reactor, for the 094 and likely the 093. But it wasn't until 1994 when submarines were reestablished as a military priority by Jiang Zemin. And they went big because within 4 years, maybe at most 5, because it was the latter half in 98, they laid down the first type 093. Now, because they're still using 2 construction ways, they've only produced 6 093s and 6 094s. And when you assume 3 years on the ways for an SSN and 4 for an SSBN, and those are approximate, you get a really good overlay with 2 submarines under construction at any one time. It wasn't until 2020 that the new facility across the bay actually started doing construction, and the first submarine was rolled out early this year. So let's talk about the 091. As I said, the first 2 hulls, they had a host of mechanical problems. They had corrosion everywhere in the primary reactor plant, and they were leaking primary coolant, which somehow got into drains in the engineering room. The reactor plant is supposed to be hermetically sealed from the rest of the boat, and yet they were seeing coolant leaking into it. They also had issues with radiation shielding. They built these boats very compact, and it made it very difficult to live in and to maintain, which is why the 3 second set of hulls, if you will, are 8 meters longer. And this extra length for clear safety and to help ease maintenance and habitability. Submarines also have a 58 megawatt thermal reactor, and they would actually get most of the updates. A new sonar system, anti-ship cruise missiles. They even got anechoic coating and a 7-bladed prop. And there is photographic evidence of that. This particular one is hull 403, and you can see the white lines there. That is marking the position of the wavefront curvature array, basically telling a tug, stay away, don't push here. Now, from a military perspective, these guys are like a lot of first-generation nuclear submarines. They are loud. For the mid to late 1970s, they were actually relatively slow at 24 and 25 knots. And their military utility, because of their noise signature and the level of technology in their sensors, and I will get to the problems with torpedoes in a moment, they had limited military utility. In the end, they had some reasonable anti-surface warfare capability, but they were limited to self-defense in ASW, despite the fact the Chinese officially labeled these as anti-submarine torpedo nuclear submarines. And just to go over some of the major pieces, the SQZ sonar system, the SQZ-3, is an integrated system. And what that meant in terms of Chinese discussion is that the active and passive functions are on the same display, which is right here. Now, the passive array in the bow is very similar to the Russian MG-10 Trauchik, or what they call Phoenix, but it's about twice the size. It's a little bit bigger than twice its diameter and about twice the height. The active array was apparently in the sail, and it looked remarkably similar to Arctica. Now, because the 091 was to go down to 300 meters and be able to fire torpedoes down to that depth, the 033s were limited to 80 meters because they used compressed air. So the Chinese wanted to be able to have a deep water or deep depth firing capability. Well, this apparently caused them to have to build shorter torpedo tubes, which means they could not use the YU-1 or the YU-4 because they're both over 7 meters in length. The YU-1's 7.5, and the YU-4 is about 7.7. You can't put that in. You cannot put those weapons in a Han. So they developed their own torpedo, the YU-3, and this was an electric torpedo, and it was an indigenous Chinese design. And it was short. It was about a little over 6 meters. And the whole point here was to be able to shoot this down to a depth of 300 meters. The problem is it took an awful long time to develop the YU-3. And it wasn't until May of 1988 that they actually did their first deep water test. And it wasn't until 89 that warshot torpedoes were started to be issued. Unfortunately, these were passive homers only, which means they're good against ships, but not so good against submarines. And it wouldn't be to the early 1990s till the YU-3A reached the fleet that had an active passive homing system. But the bottom line is, until 1989, Chinese nuclear submarines had no way to defend themselves. So if we look at the 092 SSBN, this is what they really wanted to build, a successful ballistic missile submarine. There's a single unit. It suffers from a lot of the same laments as the 091. It's loud, it's slow. It was toothless up until 1989 in terms of self-defense. In terms of its ballistic missile system, that one leaves a bit open for debate. The U.S. Department of Defense annual report never called this system operational. It was always considered questionable. The National Air and Space Intelligence Center, which has published a number of the ballistic and cruise missile reports over the years, in the last one that had the JL-1 or the CSSNX-3 missile, which was 2013, they never said that it had been deployed. It always said not yet deployed. So we really don't know what's going on with the JL-1. But even if it did work, it had limited military utility because of its short range. You're looking at theater strike only. Okay, now we wait 10 years. And then out comes the first Type 093. Now you're going to see a lot of discussion in the contemporary reporting, specifically out of the United States and Western countries, that the 093 was going to look a lot like a Victor 3. In fact, the Department of Defense annual report said it would have considerable, significant amount of Russian influence. Okay, so let's work with that these were going to be like Victor 3s. Well, if that was the case, that they were going to be operating similarly, then the first two 093s were disappointing. They were faster than the 091. But everything we had seen up to that time, both coming out of the U.S. government, out of Jane's, combat fleets, wires, everybody was saying 30-knot estimated speed goal, that was consistent with a Victor 3 propulsion plant. And the 093 is just a little bigger, and there was evidence of 2 reactors. So, okay, we expect 30 knots. There's a lot of online discussion where you see the reported speed is 28 knots, which suggests these submarines didn't make a speed goal. Now, they were slightly quieter than a 091, but they were still pretty loud, comparable to the Russian 671 Victor 1 class. They would eventually be fitted with anechoic coating, but not initially when they came out. The lead unit, I believe, has begun a midlife overhaul, and I will address this later when we talk about the May 2022 event. Now, from an anti-surface warfare capability, these boats are a lot better than the 091s. They've got better torpedoes. They've got better anti-ship cruise missiles because they can fire the YJ-18 from the torpedo tubes. And they have a better sonar. Their ASW capability is lacking. They're still noisy, and they're not fitted with a towed array, which basically means finding another boat is really hard. Now, there was some comment early on of a modification to a sail, and this was described as a new construction unit. That is not true. This is one of the first two. One of them was modified between mid-2013 and 2015, and the emphasis is on drag reduction. A sail can be between 15 to 30% the total drag of a submarine. It just depends on how it's built. These two features, the small cusp or fillet at the base and the rounded top, are known drag reduction techniques. And it was apparently put on one of the two. We don't know which one it was. It doesn't look like it was successful because it was only made to one unit. And so that modified unit probably did not reach 30 knots. You've heard me talk a bit about noise and quieting, which is a very big deal for a submarine. In 1996, when ONI came out with their first estimates of the 093, and then the diagram would come out in 1997, they were estimating this thing would be relatively quiet between the early Victor 3s and late Victor 3s. Well, comes 2009, they've dramatically changed their mind. That's because in 1996, there was not an 093 in the water, let alone under construction. This was an estimate, and it assumes significant Russian assistance. What we see in 2009 reflects the fact that we've been watching the first two boats for a while, and they were surprisingly noisy. So now how you address noise? Well, the big thing is passive isolation and reducing the vibration levels of the machinery. One of the ways that they did it in the 091 was basically single level. They put the machines on bed plates, isolated by rubber metal isolation mounts. Whether it's the BE series that I show here, because these are the more modern ones, I don't know, but they're similar to that. But when you combine high vibration levels with single level rubber metal mounts, you have a very detectable submarine. Now, the early Type 093s probably went to double isolation. That is, they have two sets of isolation mounts with an intermediate mass between them. And in the European parlance, they call these intermediate rafts. And we see a lot of discussion of rafting in online discussions. The problem is these rafts are nowhere near as effective as the very large free-floating rafts that are used on Western SSNs. So they're not even remotely comparable. But the double isolation that we see there is probably on the Type 093, which is why it's a little quieter. Now we got another 10-year gap, and that's not because building submarines weren't a priority. It's because I've only got two building ways, and the Type 094 production sucks that up with 4 boats over the course of 10 years. Now, when the next 093A showed up, we saw a lot of changes to these boats. The first was much more robust sail modifications, again, to reduce drag. The fillet is actually bigger. The top of the sail is rounded down more, and the sail is actually longer. It's about 2.5 meters longer. And even though there's more area, which would increase friction resistance, there's something called form drag, which drops dramatically as you get longer. And the ultimate outcome is that the drag of the sail is reduced. The fact that all 4 Type 093As have it suggests that the speed issue has been resolved, and these boats can do 30 knots. Now, the 093As are broken up into 3 groups, and the big determiner of that is what's the hump on behind the sail look like. These humps basically support the towed array that is deployed from the upper rudder stern tube. And the first one was kind of boxy. The second version, it was a tall, streamlined bump. And then when you see the version 3, it's not as quite as tall. It's and a little bit more streamlined. That's the only way you can tell these guys apart, at least visually. The 093As, both version 1 and 2, are quieter than the earlier ones. And they're comparable to a Russian Victor II, in my opinion. Now, how can we say this? Do we have any evidence? The answer is yes. There's been a couple of interactions with 093s where they've been detected at moderately decent ranges. We don't know what those ranges are, but the amount of time that contact is being held suggests they're noisier than they would like. In January 2018, we had that event where a submarine surfaced off the Senkaku Islands and showed the flag and all that. That was the Type 09 3A version 2 boat. You can see the taller but streamlined hump behind the sail. Had been tracked for over a day by the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, both a destroyer and a P-3C maritime patrol aircraft. When you look at the distance that the Japanese put into their announcement, and you look at about how far they went, you get an estimate of about 5 to 7 knots. It just kind of depends on the time length that you give to the detection or the tracking. This suggests that it was detected and tracked by narrowband, which is what we would expect if it didn't have as good a sound isolation as, say, a more modern attack submarine. But they did go to something very different. These boats were laid down about 2010 to 2011, and a new pneumatic or airbag isolation mounts had become available around 2004, and that's based on patent applications and technical articles. These were probably already deployed on the second two 094s, and that these are reverse engineered Russian pneumatic isolation mounts of the rubber board sheath type, which means that they're cross sections, cross layers of rubber with some reinforcement to help with shear loading. These type of mounts is what made the Project 636 so quiet. And China received the first 2 of 10 submarines in 1997 and 1998. Well, they took these mounts and they took them apart and they started working on them. And through something that we see in some articles, talk about imitative innovation. I know a lot of the CMSI articles refer to this. Through that, the Chinese were able to reverse engineer and then improve on these mounts so they could build them themselves. The problem is pneumatic mounts tend to be taller than your rubber metal mounts. And you really can't put 2 really big mounts in where you had 2 shorter ones. It doesn't work that way. So they had to probably adopt a single level of isolation. And this is why. Your shaft line has to maintain alignment. You already have an established plant. So you've only got so much space to work with. So if you have, this is a surface ship one, but it has 2 mounts. If you've got 2 mounts, the amount of vertical height you have to work with is just the addition of these 2. If one mount is bigger, then you can't put 2 in and keep the shaft line aligned. And that's a problem, because if you're going to futz with this, that's a major redesign of the entire submarine. And this is particularly true of a teardrop-shaped submarine, where the shaft line tends to be in the middle of the center line of the submarine. If you look at the size of Chinese sound mounts, the BE series are about 3 inches tall. The early pneumatic mounts vary between 4.3 to 7.5 inches. And it's going to be the bigger ones because they have the heavier load capacity. That means I can only put one mount underneath the machinery. And depending on how big this isolation mount is, you may have to reduce or even eliminate the intermediate mass, the intermediate raft. Now, one of the big things that came out of this is that these boats had towed arrays. We saw them on the 094 when they first came out, but they weren't on the first 093s. On the 093As, we saw them. And, well, we saw the deployment tube, and they're very similar to the way the Russians do it, which indicates that it's probably a Russian design, because you have to make a towed array that's at least positively buoyant. Because when you come to a stop, you don't want this thing dangling down into your shaft and your propeller. That would be bad. So the Russians have a positively buoyant array, and they have a drag-inducing drogue here that will, once you start moving, will pull it down. So if we're looking at a Russian type array, we're looking at something about 40 millimeters in diameter, and we're looking at about 350 meters in length. This is very, very different than what we see on the 054A frigates. This is not the same kind of towed array. It is, those are like 76 millimeters, and they're oil filled. If you're going to retrieve, and that's what they have to do because they're not stowing them, if you want to retrieve it on a drum, you can't have a 76 millimeter towed array. That wouldn't work. Okay. The towed array handling gear is located aft, and that's what those bulges are all about. It is not a vertical launch system, but having a towed array dramatically improves their ASW search capability because this is an honest-to-God, very low-frequency sensor. So if we look at the Type 093A version 3, these are the last two. As I said, the bump behind is not as tall, more streamlined, but everything else is pretty much the same visually. Same sail modifications, towed array. But here's where the big thing comes in. These boats are probably the first submarines in the Chinese inventory to be quiet. And I think they are because they're using advanced pneumatic mounts. And these are, in the Chinese parlance, are called JYQN. These are huge mounts. They're about 8 inches in height. The Chinese refer to them as intelligent airbags, and they are very reminiscent of the Russian APRKU mounts. Now, these mounts are used on Akulas, they're used on Oscars, and maybe the original Severodvinsk. Now, in 2002 to 2003, China went on a humongous shopping spree, and they spent billions of dollars buying Russian naval hardware. That included 2 more Sovremenies that were modified, 8 more Project 636 kilos that had the ability to fire the SSN-27 Novator Alpha or the Sizzler. Again, it would take a little bit of time for China to take these apart and rebuild them and recast them so they could produce them themselves. And again, we have patent information and technical articles that suggest that they would be available by 2010, which is a good thing because these 2 boats would have been laid down a couple of years afterwards. But again, these are very tall, definitely single level isolation. But these mounts are really good. Then we had what probably is the Type 093B. Now, the DoD annual report has been talking about this one for easily 5 years that it's coming. And it was rolled out on or about 11 January 2023. Using pixel mapping from Microsoft, or from Microsoft Paint, at least that's what H.I. Sutton used, and I used Photoshop. We both came to the 110 meters that Jane's reported. And we would expect it to be a little bit longer than your standard 093 because it's got a pump jet. And the shroud on that would extend the length. It's unclear as to whether or not this is a one-off. I kind of doubt it. There's a lot of rumors of several more of these, and this would be a good boat to have. Now, these are potentially even quieter than the 093As. And the reason for that is this is the first boat that China could really attack the vibration levels of the machinery. In 2012, 2013, China was not a powerhouse when it came to computer numerically controlled machines. Within the last 5 years, they are now competing very nicely, thank you, with Japan, Germany, and the US. So we have to assume that the main engines, the reduction gears, other rotating machineries have finer tolerances and therefore less vibration. That would make these boats quieter. But it's still a single level isolation because I'm stuck with that 9-meter pressure hull. And that is what the 093 shares with the 091, is that its maximum pressure hull is 9 meters in diameter. Now, a lot of articles suggested that that boat was the second 093, and I disagree. In May 2022, there was a lot of discussions of a submarine, this one here, on the new launch dock, and everyone was saying that's an 093B. Problem is, when you do measurements on this, you come out to about 108 meters. The other problem is that the rail line from this construction hall to this launch barge area is blocked. There are components there in the way. If we look at March, Google Earth, we can see all these components. And this is hull components and fabrication capabilities, jigs, forms, that sort of thing. In July, it's still there. If you can't get from here to here, this is not a new construction. This is an existing unit. Now, in the January 2023 event, we have a very different situation. And I apologize, there's only Sentinel Hub resolution imagery, which is definitely nothing to write home about, but it's the only thing I have. What we have here is, here's the boat that has been in the Jane's article that everybody saw around this time frame. But what we see vaguely is there's nothing in front of the transfer rails. And when you look at this in a much higher contrast, which makes it almost impossible to see anything else, there's two lines of things here. I've talked to a number of colleagues, and they say, well, those are blocks. I think they're talking keel blocks, and I'm going to disagree. I think they're transfer trolleys. And these are ones that the Russians use. We got good Google Earth imagery later on, early on in 2022, that shows the rail line is vacant. There isn't anything blocking it. That's why I believe this submarine is the first 093B. And on top of that, we've got subsequent imagery of the guy that was up there in May 2022. You can see the outer hull is pretty much complete. Yeah, they've got a little pad here and they've covered up the screw. But in July, we find this submarine with lots of outer hull removed to include an area that looks like it has an access over the reactor compartment. This sort of situation was seen again in October. and again in December when it was transferred to the other launch dock on the other side of the bay. Now, some of the plating had been replaced. It looks like this much had been put back. Here's the deal. If you have new construction, you don't see a lot of paneling removed. This is the towed array area that they were working on. This is where the handling gear goes. Look at all this outer hull sections that are removed. That is consistent with major maintenance activity. It is not consistent with new construction, which is why I believe the May 2022 event was 093 Hull 1 showing up for a midlife overhaul, reactor recore, and modernization. And given that she had been operational for 16 years, and the Chinese have adopted midlife work, and the evidence for that is almost right now, almost entirely surface ships, this is consistent. So that's why I'm going with this not being the original 093B, excuse me. So let's talk about the 94. It pretty much follows the same pattern. The last 4 have sail modifications. The last 2 are probably quieter than the other 4. They do have, up until recently, they have been assigned the JL2, which isn't quite far enough. Actually, it's really short. They can't hit a lot of CONUS targets. I've gotten a little criticism that I didn't talk about more about this, and I'll be honest with you, I really didn't look all that hard at weapons. That fell into somebody else's paper. But I did miss General Cotton, who was Stratcom, his 8 March testimony to Congress that said the 094s had begun to be backfitted with JL3s, which has an estimated range of 10,000 plus kilometers. So these are going to be able to start hitting the United States from bastion areas much closer to mainland China. So you've heard me talk about space, volume. When it comes to sound and sound isolation in the acoustic signature, it is all about volume. The 093 pressure hull, and we've measured it with Google Earth and we've seen references to it in other areas, is 9 meters in diameter. First off, that is maximum pressure hull diameter. By the time you get to the engine room in a teardrop shaped hull, it's less than that. But the best we can do is talk to the maximum. So when you look at an 093, it doesn't have the volume for the type of quieting people want it to have. The Russians had the same problem. If you look at the Alpha here, this is what they call a ring or cage RAF. And it's what they put on the Alpha. It's also on the Victor 2, and it's also on the Victor 3. And basically what you have is these isolation mounts space out the raft that holds the propulsion equipment from the pressure hull. The problem is a ring raft does not have enough mass. This is what's on Western submarines, starting with the Swiftsures and the Sturgeons. And the Sturgeon is actually the smaller of the two, and that has a 9.7 meter pressure hull diameter. The problem we have is that there's no evidence in Chinese literature of a ring or cage raft, which tends to confirm that they were doing individual component isolation with 2 sets of sound mounts. Now, when you look at a Russian 3rd generation submarine, like the Akula and the Oscar, they have a absolutely monstrous raft. And that's because they have a very big pressure hull. It's 10.9 meters in diameter. And they use huge APRK type pneumatic absorbers. Not only vertically, as you can see here, laterally as well. They are completely isolating the raft from the hull. And then the individual units are isolated from the raft themselves. So you have compound isolation with a huge, huge raft. So if you're going to want to do something like this and your tech based is Russian and you want sound levels that are Akula-like or lower, and it's pretty clear the Chinese want lower, then you need to go to a big pressure hull. We also see similar indications with the vertical launch system. We've seen a number of artist conceptions. We've seen some models that talk about vertical launchers on the 095. Well, the only submarine with vertical launch cruise missile tubes is the Type 032 King class. Now, what's interesting, and you can see in this picture, the 4 hatches, when she was built, she did not have those. Those were added from December 2019 through June 2020 when she went to the shipyard at Luzhin. These, I believe, are the similar size to the universal VLS on Chinese large surface combatants, the 055 and the 052Ds. Now, if that relationship makes sense, then you're talking very large canisters. Based on a Chinese national standards, we know the largest transport launch container for the universal VLS is 9 meters in length and 0.85 meters in diameter. Compare that to a Mark 45 Mod 1 Tomahawk canister. The Chinese is a big tube. And the payload would be expected to be the CJ-10 land attack cruise missile. You can put the YJ-18 in this. It's not required for these submarines to shoot it. We have evidence that they can launch it from a torpedo tube, but having a vertical launch in a lot of tubes would certainly improve your salvo density. And we also think they may be able to launch the ballistic missile, anti-ship ballistic missile that was tested on board the 055 in an April 2022 video. Now, a number of, again, artist conceptions, models, and this particular article show 3 missile tubes across. Now, look at the 032. That's a 2x2 relationship, okay? If you want to have 3 across, you're going to need a bigger hull because the 032 has a maximum beam of 10 meters. Since the standoff distance on a conventional submarine is usually not as big as on a nuclear boat, we're talking a pressure hull diameter of 8 to 9 meters. If 8 to 9 meters gets you 2 missile tubes across, I need to get something a lot bigger to get 3. The next issue we have is on the propulsion system. I know it's not popular, but China has had problems with maritime reactors. And this next set is likely going to be derived from Russian designs. And the reason is because Russia and China signed an agreement in September 2010 where Russia agreed to share information on reactors used in icebreakers and in nuclear power barges. This is the KLT-40S. This is going to be in the nuclear power barges, 2 of them. This is the Chinese ACPR-50S. Both use a very unique and Russian unique main coolant piping configuration where the hot leg, the piping that carries the hot water, is inside the cold water return. That's called a block design, and it's designed to minimize drag in the propulsion plant. The Chinese reactor is rated for 200 megawatts thermal. That's a good size beast. But when you look at online conversations, you constantly see discussions of a reactor with natural circulation. That means it will operate without the need for a pump. The problem is the KLT-40S and the ACPR-50S are forced circulation reactor designs. When they're operating, the pumps have to run. They do have a natural circulation capability, but it's minimal and made as an emergency cooling function when the reactor is shut down. If you don't need natural circulation, the ACPR-50S is absolutely perfectly fine as a primary power source for the 095, 096. If you insist on the requirement for natural circulation, and I think it's reasonable that the Chinese are doing that, you got to look at a new reactor design. You can't use these. Now, fortunately for them, the Akula reactor, the OK650B, is basically in the same family as the KLT-40S, and it can support natural circulation up to 30% reactor power. Problem is you need a bigger pressure hull, because the smallest hull the Russians been able to put it into is the Sierra class at 9.7 meters in diameter. This won't fit in a 093. So if we look at it, and I put this diagram here so you can see how the nested cooling system works. The hot water comes out here, goes through the steam generator cassettes, and then comes back this way. This is where the coolant begins to flow on a KLT-40S. It's way up high. You're not going to get natural circulation. This is about where it is on an OK650. You can start driving thermal currents with this. The OK650 also has a 190 megawatt thermal rating. So to assume that the Chinese next generation submarines are going to have a 200 megawatt reactor with natural circulation is not outside the realm of possibility. Now, I've been saying we need a bigger boat, to use the line from Jaws, and we start seeing hints of that. In the summer of 2017, Rear Admiral Zhao gave a briefing to a bunch of students about modernization in the Chinese, and he put up this nice diagram of a potential submarine design. First off, this is not what they're building. But it shows us some things that they're thinking about that we need to take into consideration. The first one is the pump jet back here. The second one, a large free-floating raft. These, I believe, are the large airbag isolators. I have colleagues who think maybe it could be the main seawater system. Problem is I can't make the piping here match up too well. So that's why I say they appear. I could be wrong on that. And we also see a dedicated vertical launch system. The problem is that most people who talk about this online say that's submerged displacement. That's only about 10% bigger than a 093. And I can't get this in a 093 hull. This thing has to be bigger. That's why I think this value is surface displacement, which means it's 1/3 bigger than a 093. And that's bare minimum, I think, what we need. I actually think the submarine design they're going to is even larger. And then we've seen production line workups. In October 2022, we saw a 12-meter pressure hull section. We don't see any framing, so we can't tell if it's double-hulled or single-hulled. But we see two large cylindrical objects inside, which I think are probable missile tubes. Then in December, we saw another pressure hull section. Again, we don't have evidence of framing, so we don't know what it is. And it's 11 to 12 meters. Now, some people have called it 12. I have a little bit of a problem because when I did this freeze frame and I put it in Photoshop and you expand it, there's a distortion in here that kind of screws up its circularity. So I had to use the Google Maps circle tool to try and measure it. And the best I could get was an 11.5 meters, which is completely not very helpful because with half-meter resolution imagery, It's either 11 or 12. So the only thing you can pull from that is they're looking at much larger pressure hull sections. And so when you throw this all together, this is kind of where I think they're going. Now, I do still favor a double hull construction. There has been talk of hybrid hulls. And what that is part double hull, part single hull. The problem I have with the hybrid is that it's usually a design forced issue. It's a compromise. Some other part of the submarine forces you to go to a single hull section. The Russians had to do that in the 885, 885M because of where they put the torpedo tubes, how many torpedo tubes they have, and their desire for a large magazine. Compartments 3 and 4, well, if you've already got one, you can grab extra volume by making them single hull as well. I don't see the same driver here. I'm not saying it can't happen. I just don't lean that way. So I'm looking at a double hull construction. We're looking at a pump jet. We're looking at 2 layers of coating, a sound absorbing decoupling coating on the pressure hull, anechoic coating on the outer hull, a large free-floating raft with JYQN pneumatic mounts. We're looking at a 200 megawatt reactor with 30% natural circulation capability. We've got a towed array, a large array up here. I don't know if it's going to be cylindrical or a conformal. Different navies are now going the conformal route. The Russians have, the US has. The Brits have been doing it since day one. But with that kind of pressure hull diameter, you have a large magazine. I mean, with 10.9 meter pressure hull diameter, an Akula can carry 40 weapons in the torpedo room. And there's room for 18 vertical launch tubes. We're looking at a speed of between 31 and 32 knots. And depending on what the type of propulsion system it is, it could be like a 971 Akula or as quiet as an improved Akula. Both of these boats are quieter than an improved Los Angeles. For the Type 096, we're looking at, I gave them 16 tubes because, darn it, everybody else has 16 tubes just about, so let's not make them any, less offensive than anybody else. Pretty much a lot of the same stuff you saw in the 9.5 is going to port over. That's how the Chinese do things. Okay, but you're still looking at a pretty darn big boat. 150 meters in length, 15,750 tons submerged displacement. Slower, 27, maybe 28 knots. But because the quieting is set up, there's still going to be very quiet submarines. So if we kind of mark out where China has been, the 091 and the 093 early Shangs are historical record. Same thing with the early Jins and the Jia. Where we go after that is my interpretation of incorporation of Russian-based sound quieting techniques, sound quieting technology, and then later on, the vibration reduction due to improvements in Chinese manufacturing capabilities. And you get down here to the 095 and 096, these are going to be bloody hard boats to find. Now, some people have suggested they could be quieter, and I don't disagree. I may be being a little bit conservative, but I would also say that what I am seeing in terms of Chinese technical literature and patents do not reflect the type of quieting that the Russians have put into the Akula 2. So I'm going to lean this way for now. So this is where we are. China started building their own boats because the Soviet Union chose not to help them. Ironically, Russia has been a considerable supplier of technology, submarines, and expertise since 1996. Up until that time, China has been able to build functional submarines, but they weren't very effective. And by taking the Russian technology, using imitative innovation, China has modified proven Russian submarine technology in reactors, sound isolation systems, and probably towed arrays and torpedoes to meet their needs. So after nearly 50 years since the first 091 was commissioned, China is now on the verge, and what I mean by verge is that they could be building them now. The design is done, in my opinion. They could be building these now. They've been testing their manufacturing capabilities that we saw last year. So they're on the verge of producing world-class nuclear-powered submarines. And the 095 has the potential to be China's improved Akula 1. The 096 has the potential to be very close to the Dolgoruki class, with the exception of quieting. There it will be more like the improved Akula 1. But no matter how you slice this, the implications for the United States Navy and our allies is going to be quite profound.
Very well presented, Chris. Really good information. Absolutely. I will, if you're open to it, if anybody's online. Okay, here we do. We do have a question here. Let me put this up here. How quiet will the Type 95 be compared to the latest U.S. and U.K. SSNs?
If you're talking Virginia and Astute, they won't be. I don't believe they'll be as quiet. But I've got to tell you, when improved Akula 1s or the Akula 2s go to sea, we have a really tough time finding them. So in comparison to what China has right now, these are much, much better. These will be much harder to find. And I'm anticipating their sensor systems will be better, largely because they're quieter.
I will open it to the crowd. If anybody is online, we do have a pretty good amount of people. This is probably the most people we've ever had. You've attracted a good crowd, Chris. Any other questions from the YouTube crowd? Please post it into the chat area there. We can maybe go into some product updates while we wait for that, and we can kind of wrap around
Okay,
back.
I can take.
Go ahead, Larry.
I can take that on. We've got a couple of things we're doing that'll be out very soon. Well, first thing, probably of interest to most of the players, is we're going to release a maintenance update of Harpoon 5. There have been a lot of mods, tweaks, clarifications, some changes that have appeared in the Naval Sitrep, and I was looking at things and my goodness, we haven't printed a new version of the rules for over 2 years. So the June 2021 version of the rules, still 5th edition, will be replaced by what we're calling right now a 1 September 2023 version of the rules. If you have the PDF, you will get an automatic free download. And what we're doing is all the changes that matter. I mean, we're not doing this for typos or math errors, but all the major changes are marked in red. We're going to leave it that way for 1 calendar quarter, and then we're going to upload it in black, because then we get to start over and start, if there's any tweaks, that will show up. We adopted the red system because it so we could stay sane and understand what's been changed since we worked on it last week. There will be a new print version and PDF version. You'll have to buy the print version. I'm sorry, we can't update that for you. We're also going to try a little experiment. We've been publishing Form 10s and Form 20s for years, and sometimes they're okay. Let's just be frank. People have not been buying them as often as they've been asking for them. We get a lot of requests for Form 10s, and the sales have not been strong. So we're going to try an experiment and see if this format works better. We're going to take an old scenario that appeared in Battles for the Third World War back in the old GDW days, and called Tattletale. We're going to put it out there with Harpoon 5 standard Form 10s and 20s, and with this scenario, and it'll be just a single publication, and it's going to cost you $3, and you're going to get the forms with all the data in them. Some are NATO, there are NATO ships and a single Russian ship, a Mod Kashin, and we're going to see how people react to this. It is an experiment, and we want to encourage feedback. We want to encourage suggestions, because we want to make this information available to you. And you obviously like the Form 10s, but you haven't liked the way they've been produced before. Beyond those two immediate things, we're obviously going to have an October sit rep. Commonwealth Navies is still in the hopper, and we're chewing on that very large elephant as best we can. It's going to be 2 books, surface ships and Navy or aircraft, just like America's Navy and Russia's Navy. After that, we've got Japan already in the queue, but we got to get Commonwealth Navies out first. And I don't know what we want to talk about beyond that, Chris. Maybe high tide?
Captain's edition.
I was going to ask.
The webpage, yes. I mean, there's such an active community. And I told Jim Baker to go live with it this afternoon. We have uploaded on our website all the original GDW Captain's Editions files for the maps, forms, the counters, everything's there. Yeah, counters, you're going to have to print them out and glue them on a cardboard yourself, but it's all there. And we're looking for active communities, websites, places where people are posting stuff about Captain's Edition, and we'll gladly include those on our link as well, on our webpage. We want to support the community while we get organized, get a few alligators taken care of, and then we will be developing our own new version of Captain.
New version. That's awesome.
Well, we wanted to do it for a couple of years, actually, when we discovered that there were so many people who were still trading files and playing the game and having a lot of fun with it. You think the new version of Captain's, there's going to be a completely new version of Captain's Edition eventually, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful move. That's a great move. Good move.
Thank you. I mean, we want to do it, and it's just a question of getting enough editorial resources, as they say, and so we're devoted to that.
Yeah, we need to give Andy Doty credit for proposing that we do that, that we put it up. And, in hindsight, Larry and I talked about it, and it really is the right thing to do. We're not selling it, and people still like to play it. So let's just
that's great.
Put it up.
GDW is long gone. They're not losing any money off of this. So let's get it out there. Yeah. I mean, we want people to play the game and have fun, and we'll go from there.
And Kevin Martell had done a very good Vassal conversion of it, by the way, which allows for it to be played double blind very easily, which is really nice, by the way. So, yeah, that's great. I think that'll kind of bring people into that slightly simpler model, and then they'll be ready to be your next customers for that new one, which I do absolutely look forward to. And I'd be happy to play test it, by the way.
Right. One of the things that's going to show up in the sit rep, Peter, is an issue that our good friend Tom has been on our case about, which is sonobuoy localization.
Mm-hmm.
There will be specific rules on that, and but we're not going to go down, I think, quite the path he'd like, which is, roll for every single last sonobuoy. No, we're not doing that. You're going to get a more generalized approach that will depend upon how big the area you're searching is and how many buoys are in the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
I've also got a number of patterns that I can put in, graphics that shows you how the Navy used to do it through a declassified engagement analysis. The one I think I sent you. It's got some sonobuoy patterns in there, particularly localization ones.
That's awesome. So as far as the sit rep is concerned, are you will there be additional Dawn of the Battleship or Command at Sea materials in it as well? I do have to absolutely applaud you all for continuing to broaden the offerings for all of your rule sets. I just, as somebody who loves Dawn and Fear, I appreciate it. So
Dawn is so much fun to play because there's not a lot of tech. You just get out there and slam away at the other guy. And I admit, I love the ship designs, so wacky they may be.
Except the French.
Oh, you gotta love the French.
Floating hotels, yes.
Wait, somebody put a photo curve so we can go, what the hell is that? I mean, you can actually shoot a shell through the middle of it and it won't hit anything. Yeah, we've got scenarios lined up for Dawn of the Battleship and for Harpoon. I don't know if we'll ever be able to cram all 4 scenarios for all 4 games into a single issue, but we're trying to rotate and provide a certain balance. And also Command at Sea. We've got that one that Mike designed for Historicon. We might be able to put in there if it'll fit. Chris is doing a couple articles.
My second one's going to be on revision to aerial search for Command at Sea, because it is anything but what we have. I've had some really good discussions. It's been a couple of years, but I had some really good discussions with a fellow by the name of Jim Swarrick, who is a maritime patrol aircraft PBY kind of guy. And we talked a lot about the efficacy of visual search, and it is nothing like what we currently have. So you're going to see a major change. It's going to be vexing and frustrating.
Okay. I need that because I've used that as basically my baseline for everything I ever do. So very good.
Strangely enough, anytime we drill down on our particular issue, we find out that our numbers are optimistic. And these will be more realistic.
Okay.
And players are just going to have to deal with it. Reality.
All right. Challenge accepted.
Reality is it's a cruel mistress.
Yeah. I think we will end there. This is probably our longest Dawn Patrol / Dusk Patrol. So your presentation was incredible, Chris, by the way. I appreciate the detail and the...
and I think you put the link to the paper on the chat section.
I did, and I will... Yes, I did. I put it on the comment to the YouTube taping of this as well.
Okay.
So I will... Go ahead, Larry. Any last comment?
I was going to say, anybody who watches this show knows just as much about Chinese nuclear submarines as the Naval War College.
Probably as much as most of the Chinese as well. I appreciate y'all talking to me and to the crowd and allowing me to probe the offerings of the ATG. As usual, awesome information, great discussion, and I look forward to continuing to do this as often as we can. So,
alrighty,
we'll look forward to our next visit.
Absolutely. All right, have a good one.
Take care. Bye bye.